The village of Eldridge rested quietly in a hidden valley surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills. It was a small place where everyone knew each other, where life followed the steady rhythm of seasons. In the mornings, mist floated over the fields, covering the green crops like a soft blanket. Farmers would walk out to their land, baskets in hand, ready to begin a day of hard work. Children ran along the narrow dirt paths, their laughter echoing between the cottages and the tall trees. Elders would sit outside their homes, telling stories of old battles, ancient heroes, and mysterious events long forgotten by most. It was a life simple and peaceful. Yet beneath the calm surface, whispers of danger had begun to stir. Among the villagers, a small group of travelers arrived one crisp morning, carrying only the clothes on their backs and expressions heavy with exhaustion. Their skin was pale, their eyes shadowed with fear, and their movements careful as if they were haunted by something no one could see. They came from lands far beyond the neighboring kingdom, places where stories of darkness were spoken only in hushed tones. The villagers, at first hesitant, offered food and shelter. Curiosity mixed with caution as the travelers told fragments of their journey, about towns abandoned in chaos, about fires that seemed to burn without reason, and shadows that moved where they should not. Their voices trembled slightly as they spoke, yet the fear in their eyes told a story far stronger than words could convey. Some villagers whispered among themselves that perhaps the travelers were exaggerating. Monsters in the forests had always been part of old tales, but no one had ever seen such creatures for themselves. Yet there was something in the way the travelers looked, a haunted tension that could not be ignored. The village children, normally fearless, watched from behind doors and windows, sensing that these strangers brought news of things far more dangerous than ordinary life could offer. Life continued in Eldridge, but unease began to grow. Nights felt colder and quieter, as if the valley itself held its breath. Strange noises started to appear in the darkness, rustling in the trees that could not be explained by the wind, low growls that vanished before anyone could pinpoint the source, and fleeting shapes that flickered just beyond the corner of the eye. Even the bravest of villagers felt a shiver of fear, a sense that something unseen was watching them. Then the first signs of real danger arrived. Fields that had been vibrant with crops were flattened overnight, as if some enormous weight had passed through. The villagers found footprints unlike any animal they had known, deep and irregular, moving in ways that made no sense. Chickens and cows were missing from their pens, and the river that ran past the village carried strange debris along its current. The elders, who had lived through countless seasons, felt a chill run through them. They knew this was no ordinary threat. The travelers gathered the villagers together one evening, their faces serious in the dim light of a setting sun. They spoke of the Terran monsters, beings neither fully human nor animal, whose presence brought fear that was both physical and psychological. They told of the creatures' intelligence, their cunning, and their sheer strength. Villagers listened, some in disbelief, some in silent dread. Mothers held their children close, fathers clenched their fists, and the old men and women exchanged worried glances. It was a tale too terrifying to fully imagine, yet too real to ignore. For the next few days, tension in Eldridge grew. Villagers began to notice subtle changes in their surroundings. Birds seemed quieter than usual, as if they sensed the danger. The air carried a faint metallic scent that no one could identify. Livestock refused to go out to pasture, and even the most routine chores took on a sense of urgency. Every sound in the night felt amplified: the snapping of a twig, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of some unknown creature. Sleep became difficult, with dreams haunted by visions of shadowy figures and glowing eyes. Despite the growing fear, the villagers tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. Children still ran through the fields, though fewer in number and always in pairs or groups. Markets remained open, though fewer people visited. Life went on, but every day carried an undercurrent of anxiety. People spoke in hushed tones, careful to avoid alarming others unnecessarily. Every villager had a sense that something larger than themselves was approaching, that the valley would soon face a test it had never known before. One morning, the Travelers guided a group of villagers to inspect the fields. They pointed out the tracks, the flattened crops, and other subtle signs that indicated the Terran monsters were not just passing through. They were studying the village, learning the habits of its people and preparing to strike. The villagers were struck by fear, but also by a strange determination. They had survived storms, famines, and diseases, and though this threat was unlike any they had faced, the human instinct to protect one's home and family began to take root. Evenings became a time for gathering, not for stories of the past, but for discussions of survival. Villagers shared knowledge of the land, hidden paths through the forest, old caves and hollows, and places where traps could be set. They began to understand that their home, which had always seemed small and quiet, could become a stronghold if they used every bit of knowledge they had. The travelers taught them how to move quietly, how to observe patterns, and how to prepare for attacks that were inevitable. Children, despite their fear, learned quickly. They were nimble, fast, and capable of noticing things adults might miss. Under careful supervision, they helped with simple tasks, placing small alarms in the forest, carrying messages, and keeping watch during the night. Even the elders, though frail, found roles, guiding the younger generation, sharing wisdom, and offering encouragement. It was a time of preparation, of subtle training, and of quiet courage building in every heart. Yet, the fear never completely left. Shadows in the night seemed darker. The wind carried whispers that could not be understood, and the air felt charged with tension. Villagers knew that each day brought them closer to a confrontation they were not yet ready for, but that could not be avoided. The sense of impending danger was like a weight pressing down on the valley, invisible but constant, shaping every thought and action. As the sun set one evening, the travelers and villagers gathered by the river. Reflections of orange and gold shimmered on the water, but the beauty of the scene could not mask the unease in their hearts. They spoke quietly of the days to come, of strategies, and of hope. There was a shared understanding. They were facing something that might seem impossible to overcome, but together, they could at least try. That night, Eldridge was silent in a new way. The mist hovered over the village like a protective cloak, yet it also seemed like a warning. Every door was secured, every path watched, and every heart held a mixture of fear and determination. The villagers went to sleep knowing that the days ahead would test them in ways they had never imagined, that their lives would be changed forever, and that survival depended not only on courage, but on unity, intelligence, and the willingness to face the unknown. And as the moon rose over the hills, casting long shadows across the valley, no one could yet see what awaited them. The Terran monsters were coming, drawn to Eldridge by some force beyond understanding. The village, peaceful and simple only days before, was about to be thrust into a battle for survival that would demand every ounce of human strength, spirit, and resilience. The calm before the storm had ended, and the first whispers of terror were about to become reality. The first attack came without warning. It was before dawn, when the village of Eldridge still slept under a veil of mist. A chilling howl echoed through the valley, a sound unlike anything the villagers had ever heard. It was deep and guttural, vibrating through the air, and it froze everyone in their beds. At first, some thought it was the wind or perhaps a pack of wild animals from the forest. But the sound came again, closer this time, with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, almost intelligent. By the time the villagers stepped outside, the horror was visible. Smoke rose from the northern edge of Eldridge, where the first homes were set aflame. Livestock ran in panicked chaos, the cows and goats trampling each other as they fled. The villagers' hearts pounded in fear and disbelief. They had prepared for danger, studied the warnings of the travelers, and practiced quiet vigilance, but nothing could have readied them for the sight of the Terran monsters. The creatures were massive, their bodies grotesque, and unlike anything in human experience. They moved with unnatural grace, balancing size and speed in a way that made them terrifying to behold. Their eyes glowed faintly in the early morning light, scanning the village as if calculating every step. Their limbs ended in claws or talons, and their teeth were long, sharp, and yellowed. Yet it was not just their appearance that frightened the villagers. It was the sense that these creatures were intelligent, that they were aware and that they understood fear. Chaos erupted instantly. Families shouted to one another, running through the village streets trying to gather children and pets. Some grabbed whatever weapons they could find, pitchforks, axes, even kitchen knives, but everyone knew the Terran monsters were far stronger than any human could be. The travelers moved quickly, calling villagers to follow them to safer areas, showing them hidden paths through the woods and small stone shelters where they might hide. The first confrontation was devastating. One of the monsters lunged toward a small cluster of homes, its claws ripping through doors and walls with terrifying ease. Windows shattered, sending glass flying, and the villagers screamed as they scrambled to escape. A young boy tripped over a loose stone, and a traveler dove to save him, narrowly avoiding the monster's swipe. The boy's mother clutched him tightly, tears streaming down her face, and whispered words of comfort that she did not truly feel. As the day progressed, more monsters appeared, spreading out in a slow, deliberate advance. The villagers tried to defend their homes, but it quickly became clear that conventional fighting was useless. Even the largest of men, swinging axes and pitchforks, could not reach the monsters without risking their own lives. The creatures seemed to anticipate every move, avoiding traps and responding with alarming precision. Panic threatened to overwhelm the village, and the villagers realized that their survival depended on more than courage. It depended on intelligence, cooperation, and quick thinking. The travelers called an emergency meeting at the center of the village. A makeshift barricade had been set up, and villagers huddled behind it, exhausted but alert. The travelers explained that the Terran monsters were not mindless beasts. They were observing, learning, and testing the villagers' reactions. Every frightened cry, every hasty movement was being noted. They warned that mercy was unlikely, that survival required planning, and that hesitation could cost lives. Villagers worked in small groups, setting simple traps in areas where the monsters had passed. They dug pits hidden beneath brush, tied ropes across narrow paths, and set fires as distractions. It was a frantic, exhausting effort. Sweat ran down faces streaked with dirt and fear. Children, under careful supervision, helped where they could, carrying small supplies, sounding warnings, or simply staying alert. Even the elders, though fragile, offered guidance, pointing out safe spots and recalling old stories of how people had survived harsh threats long ago. Each night brought more terror. The monsters roamed freely through the outskirts of the village, their glowing eyes visible through the trees. Sometimes they would pause and emit low, almost musical sounds that were both terrifying and hypnotic. The villagers found it difficult to sleep, taking turns standing watch. Fires were kept burning, and every door and window was secured with whatever materials were available. In the darkest hours, when even the travelers could not see clearly, the village held its breath, hoping that the monsters would pass, yet knowing they would return. Despite the fear, small victories began to emerge. Villagers discovered that the monsters reacted to loud sounds in strange ways, sometimes pausing or retreating when startled. Fire caused them to hesitate, though it was dangerous to approach too closely. Reflections in water or shiny surfaces seemed to confuse them temporarily. These discoveries were celebrated quietly, providing hope and a renewed sense of control. The villagers began to understand that while brute strength could not defeat the Terran monsters, cleverness and strategy could help them survive. Families were forced to make heartbreaking decisions. Some homes were abandoned as families fled to safer areas, or the forest shelters the travelers had identified. Others chose to stay, protecting what remained of their property and livestock. Arguments arose over who should go first, which paths were safest, and how best to protect children. The travelers mediated where possible, offering advice and calming heated emotions, but the strain was undeniable. Even the strongest of hearts began to feel the weight of constant fear. In the midst of this chaos, heroes emerged. A young woman, barely 17, organized a group of villagers to carry water to trapped families and help set up barriers. A retired blacksmith used his knowledge to reinforce doors and create simple, yet effective traps. Children ran messages between groups alerting them to the monsters' movements. Each act of courage inspired others, creating a fragile but growing sense of hope. Even in the darkest moments, humanity shone through the fear, proving that courage could exist alongside terror. Days passed in a haze of tension and exhaustion. The villagers learned to move quietly through their own streets, to communicate with gestures instead of words, and to trust instincts honed by fear. They began to anticipate the monster's behavior, noticing patterns in their attacks and movements. The valley, once a place of peace, became a battlefield of wits and vigilance. Every shadow, every sound, held meaning. Even the forest, which had always been a place of comfort and beauty, now seemed dangerous, filled with unseen eyes and silent predators. The travelers encouraged the villagers to adapt, to use the land to their advantage. Narrow paths were blocked with fallen trees, hidden caves became temporary shelters, and vantage points on hills allowed lookouts to monitor approaching monsters. Villagers learned to signal each other using simple codes, light reflections, drumbeats, and small fires that conveyed messages without revealing their location. Cooperation became essential, and every person, no matter age or strength, had a role to play. Even as strategies formed and small victories were achieved, the fear never fully left. The Terran monsters were patient, observing and learning from every encounter. The villagers knew that any mistake could be fatal. Sleep was short and uneasy, meals were taken in small, quiet portions, and every movement was measured. Yet despite the terror, a sense of determination grew. Eldridge, though battered and afraid, refused to surrender. Families found strength in one another. Mothers comforted children who had nightmares of glowing eyes and sharp claws. Fathers took turns standing watch while others rested. Elders shared knowledge of the land, old stories that suddenly became practical guides for survival. The travelers, though strangers, became leaders, teaching techniques of stealth, observation, and defense. Slowly, a community of resilience began to emerge. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the villagers gathered in a quiet clearing. Fires were lit, not as beacons for the monsters, but as signals to each other. The travelers spoke of hope, reminding them that while the Terran monsters were strong and intelligent, humans had their own strengths, creativity, cooperation, and the ability to learn quickly. The villagers, though weary, began to feel a spark of confidence. They were beginning to understand that while fear was unavoidable, it could be harnessed to make them stronger. That night, Eldridge slept lightly. The valley was silent except for distant howls and rustling leaves. Every person, from the smallest child to the oldest elder, remained alert, knowing that the next attack could come at any moment. Yet in the midst of fear, a sense of purpose had formed. The villagers had faced terror together, learned from it, and begun to prepare for the trials ahead. By the end of the week, Eldridge was transformed. What had been a peaceful, quiet village was now a community hardened by fear, strengthened by cooperation, and alert to every sign of danger. The Terran monsters had arrived, bringing terror and destruction, but they had also revealed the courage and resilience hidden within every villager. And though the battles ahead were far from over, Eldridge had taken its first steps toward survival, ready to face the monsters again with determination, intelligence, and hope. Days had passed since the first terrifying attacks, and Eldridge had changed more than anyone could have imagined. The village that had once been quiet and calm now thrummed with tension and preparation. Every sound, the snapping of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, was a signal to be observed and understood. Villagers had learned to move quietly through their own streets, to watch each other for signs of fear or alert, and to prepare for attacks that seemed inevitable. Yet despite the strategies, the losses weighed heavily on everyone. Homes had been destroyed, livestock lost, and families were separated. The fear of what the Terran monsters could do next pressed on every heart, and a sense of desperation grew stronger with each passing day. The elders of Eldridge gathered in the center of the village one evening, the travelers among them. Their faces were etched with worry, and their voices carried the weight of someone who had faced danger before. They spoke quietly, debating what could be done to save what remained of the village. They knew that fighting blindly would only bring more death. They needed a plan, a way to survive, and perhaps, if possible, to communicate. The travelers had warned them that these creatures did not understand mercy in human terms, but the villagers hoped for some form of negotiation, some sign that the monsters could be reasoned with. A decision was made. A small group of villagers would attempt to approach the Terran monsters not with weapons but with offerings. It was a terrifying idea. Even thinking about going near these creatures made hearts pound and knees shake. But the elders insisted that the village had to try every possible way to survive. If the monsters could be persuaded to spare the village, even temporarily, it would give them the time needed to strengthen defenses and protect lives. Preparations were careful and meticulous. The group included a traveler experienced in survival, 2 villagers familiar with the terrain, and a young woman known for her calm presence under pressure. They gathered food from the remaining supplies: bread, dried fruits, and meat that had been preserved before the attacks. Blankets and other simple items were included as symbolic offerings. Every piece was chosen to show respect and goodwill. There was no illusion that the monsters would understand in human terms, but it was a gesture born of hope and courage. The villagers made their way toward the edge of the forest where the first attacks had begun. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves or distant howl setting their nerves on edge. They moved slowly, in a formation designed to keep them hidden as much as possible, relying on the lessons learned from previous encounters. The traveler whispered instructions in low tones: "Stay quiet. Observe. Do not show fear. If they notice you too soon, we retreat." As they approached the clearing where the monsters had been seen before, they found traces of their presence. Deep footprints pressed into the mud, broken branches where massive claws had torn through trees, and strange markings that seemed deliberate but incomprehensible. The young woman stepped forward carefully, placing a small basket of offerings on a flat stone. She stepped back, heart pounding, and waited. At first, nothing happened. The wind moved through the trees, birds took flight, and silence returned. The villagers held their breath, afraid to make even the slightest sound. Then slowly a shadow moved. One of the Terran monsters emerged from the trees, its eyes glowing faintly in the fading light. It was massive, larger than any human or animal, but it did not immediately attack. Instead, it tilted its head, observing the offerings and then the humans. It made a sound low and guttural, unlike anything the villagers had heard before. It was almost musical, a rhythm that seemed purposeful. The traveler stepped forward slightly, holding a hand up in a gesture of peace. "We mean no harm," he said quietly. "We only wish to survive." The monster paused, its glowing eyes studying him. It did not respond in any way the villagers could understand, but it did not attack either. A tense silence filled the clearing. Every heartbeat felt loud, every breath shallow. Encouraged by the lack of aggression, one of the villagers took a small step forward and offered bread from the basket. The monster sniffed the air, then turned its head, watching carefully. It reached out a clawed limb, hovering just above the offering, and withdrew. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it carried meaning. The villagers understood that the creatures were curious, assessing them, but still cautious. They were not ready to show mercy, yet they were not immediately hostile either. The delegation returned to the village with heavy hearts. They had survived the encounter, but the monster's intentions remained unclear. The elders met to discuss what had been learned. It was apparent that the Terran monsters were not mindless destroyers. They were testing the humans, observing their reactions, and perhaps measuring their intelligence. Mercy, as humans understood it, was unlikely. Yet there was a glimmer of understanding. The creatures could be studied, patterns could be learned, and survival might be possible through cleverness and careful observation. Over the next days, the villagers focused on observation. Small teams were sent to watch from hidden positions, taking notes on the monsters' movements, behavior, and responses. They learned that the creatures were highly intelligent, communicating through gestures, sounds, and patterns that were consistent and deliberate. Each encounter provided more insight. They discovered that loud noises could startle the monsters, that fire caused them to hesitate, and that reflective surfaces created confusion. These small discoveries were shared among the villagers, and gradually, a plan began to form. Survival depended not only on hiding, but on using the monsters' behavior against them. The villagers also worked on communication within their own community. Signals were established, reflective flashes, low drum beats, and small fires in specific patterns. Each person had a role, from scouts to watchers, from those preparing supplies to those standing guard. Children were included carefully, assigned tasks that were safe but important. The village, once a place of quiet routine, became a coordinated community of survival, each member aware of the stakes and ready to play their part. As the villagers adapted, small victories provided hope. Traps were set that slowed the monsters' advance, alerts were raised that prevented ambushes, and moments of confusion allowed humans to reclaim small areas of the village. These victories were never without risk. Each encounter carried danger, and every mistake could be fatal. Yet with each success, the villagers gained confidence, learning that intelligence and preparation could rival raw strength. Despite these efforts, fear remained. The Terran monsters were patient, waiting for mistakes, watching for weaknesses. Nights were sleepless, with every shadow a potential threat. Even when monsters did not attack, their presence was felt, a constant reminder that danger was never far away. Families slept in shifts, watchful eyes scanning the darkness, listening for the faintest hint of movement. The valley seemed alive with tension, every rustle, every whisper, every shift in the wind carrying meaning. The travelers encouraged reflection. They reminded the villagers that fear, while natural, could be harnessed. It sharpened senses, demanded attention, and strengthened determination. The villagers began to see that survival was not just about avoiding the monsters, it was about understanding them, learning their ways, and using knowledge as a weapon. One night, the young woman who had been part of the delegation approached the travelers. "We cannot fight them head-on," she said quietly, "but we can outthink them. If we understand them, we can survive." The travelers nodded, impressed by her insight. "Exactly," one said. "Strength is not always physical. Intelligence, strategy, and unity can be far more powerful." From that moment, Eldridge became a community focused not only on defense but on learning. Scouts recorded every movement, watchers analyzed patterns, and the village became a hive of careful observation. Children learned to spot disturbances in the forest, to alert others quickly and to stay calm under pressure. Elders shared old knowledge of the land, hidden paths, secret hollows, natural barriers that could be used to the village's advantage. Every skill, every lesson, every moment of attention became part of their survival plan. Over the following weeks, the villagers began to gain small but important victories. They set traps that slowed the monsters, misdirected them with signals, and avoided direct confrontations whenever possible. Confidence grew, not in the sense that the monsters could be defeated, but in the knowledge that humans could adapt, survive, and even manipulate situations to their advantage. It was a fragile, growing hope, but it was enough to sustain them through the long nights. The Terran monsters continued their observations. Sometimes they would approach and then withdraw without reason. Other times they would linger, watching from the shadows, testing patience and reaction. The villagers learned to remain calm, to record each behavior, and to anticipate future actions. Slowly, a rhythm formed: observation, preparation, and cautious engagement. The monsters were still dangerous, terrifying, and unpredictable, but the villagers were learning to navigate the uncertainty. In the end, the villagers realized that survival depended not on weapons or brute strength alone, but on courage, intelligence, and cooperation. They could not defeat the Terran monsters by force, but the village of Eldridge had transformed from a quiet, peaceful settlement into a place of constant vigilance. The people moved like shadows through their own streets, every step measured, every glance purposeful. The Terran monsters had not returned, in full force yet, but the villagers knew it was only a matter of time. Preparation had become a way of life. Families worked together to strengthen homes, set traps, and ensure that every child and elder had a safe place to hide. Even the simplest tasks, carrying water, tending to crops, gathering firewood, were now acts of careful strategy. The travelers, who had been guiding the villagers, organized small teams for scouting and observation. Each team had a role. One would watch for signs of the monster's approach, another would test traps and barriers, while others communicated through signals and warnings. The villagers had learned quickly. Even those who were once timid had discovered courage they never knew they possessed. A retired blacksmith helped reinforce doors and create simple but effective defensive tools, while a young mother trained her children to spot disturbances in the forest and alert others silently. The unity of the village was remarkable. Fear had not destroyed them, it had made them stronger. Then, the Terran monsters struck again. This time they came in small groups, moving with terrifying precision. The first sign was the howl in the distance, a warning that sent shivers down the spines of every villager awake at night. From the tree line, the monsters emerged, eyes glowing faintly, muscles rippling as they moved with inhuman grace. The villagers, now prepared, watched silently from hidden vantage points. Their hearts pounded, but their faces were calm. They had learned that panic would only give the monsters an advantage. The battle began quietly. The villagers had set traps in the fields and along the paths leading into the village. Pits hidden beneath brush, tripwires connected to small alarms, and fires arranged as distractions were all part of the plan. As the monsters advanced, the first trap was triggered. One creature fell into a pit, its limbs flailing, unable to escape. Another approached a tripwire, sending a loud crash through the air. Startled, it paused, giving the villagers time to reposition and strike with other measures. Though the monsters were intelligent and strong, they had not anticipated every action of the humans. Villagers moved with precision. A team of young men and women approached silently from the side, using rocks and sticks to guide the monsters toward prepared traps. Children, safely hidden, watched the battle and signaled movements to the adults. It was dangerous work, yet everyone understood that each act, no matter how small, could save lives. The monsters, though frightening, were being slowed, confused, and gradually forced to retreat. The fight was exhausting. Villagers had to balance courage with caution, striking at the right moment and retreating quickly when necessary. Every encounter carried risk. One man misjudged a monster's movement and barely escaped with his life, his clothes torn and body bruised. Another young woman was knocked to the ground by the force of a monster, but crawled away under cover of smoke from the fires. Each near miss reminded the villagers that the monsters were not just creatures, they were a calculated threat, capable of learning from their mistakes and adapting to human strategies. Over the following days, the villagers continued to adapt. They discovered that the monsters were highly sensitive to sound, retreating or hesitating when loud noises occurred. Fire, carefully used, could scare them away, though it required careful handling to prevent danger to the humans. Reflections in water or polished surfaces caused confusion, giving the villagers brief but crucial opportunities to escape or attack. Each discovery was shared quickly, allowing the village to improve its defenses constantly. Families worked together to protect each other. Mothers and fathers took shifts standing watch while others rested. Children carried messages through the village, alerting teams to approaching monsters or the triggering of traps. Even the elders played a role, guiding the younger villagers and ensuring that no one acted recklessly. The villagers began to operate like a single organism, each movement coordinated, each action purposeful. Fear was still present, but it had become a tool for focus rather than a force of paralysis. As the attacks continued, the villagers also began to anticipate the monsters' behavior. Patterns emerged. The monsters preferred certain paths, reacted predictably to noise and fire, and avoided traps in ways that could be studied. Using this knowledge, the villagers set more sophisticated defenses. They created decoy paths to lure monsters into traps, used controlled fires to guide movements, and prepared ambush points where the monsters would be most vulnerable. The valley, once peaceful, had become a chessboard, with humans and monsters moving carefully, each calculating the next move. During one particularly tense night, the monsters advanced closer than ever before. The villagers, ready and alert, executed their plan. Fires blazed on the edges of the forest while hidden pits and tripwires slowed the monsters' advance. Rocks and sticks guided them into narrow paths where teams waited with ropes, nets, and other improvised tools. The monsters struggled against these traps, their movements frustrated and unpredictable. It was exhausting work for the humans, yet it was also exhilarating. For the first time, they felt that victory, however small, was possible. The battle was not without losses. Some villagers were injured, others exhausted beyond measure. One team had to retreat after a monster broke through a barrier, reminding everyone that the threat was still very real. Yet each encounter also brought lessons. The villagers learned to adjust, to anticipate errors, and to rely on one another. Each survival, each small victory, strengthened the community's resolve. Courage was no longer just an individual trait. It had become a collective force binding everyone together. Over time, Eldridge discovered the monsters' weaknesses. Loud noises could startle them, fire could deter them temporarily, and reflective surfaces confused them. Even a simple sound or flicker of light could buy crucial seconds. The villagers refined their tactics, combining their knowledge with observation of the monsters' reactions. Every day they became more effective, turning fear into a weapon. The Terran monsters were intelligent, but humans had adaptability, creativity, and cooperation on their side. The villagers also realized the importance of patience. They could not attack blindly or rely solely on traps. Observation, timing, and understanding the monster's habits were key. Every encounter became a lesson in strategy, teaching them how to survive, how to defend, and how to outthink a foe far stronger than themselves. Even the youngest children learned to watch, to signal, and to stay calm under pressure. The village had become a school of survival, each lesson vital to the community's future. Despite the terror and exhaustion, hope grew. Villagers saw that the monsters could be slowed, manipulated, and even repelled temporarily. The valley, once a place of fear, now held opportunities for defense. Courage, intelligence, and cooperation had proven powerful. Every small victory gave energy to continue. Every success reinforced the belief that survival was possible. Eldridge had faced death and destruction, yet its people had adapted and learned. By the end of the week, the Terran monsters had begun to retreat. The villagers, though still cautious, were proud of their progress. They had survived attacks, learned valuable lessons, and discovered strengths they never knew they had. The valley, though scarred, was not lost. Fire had destroyed fields. Some homes were in ruins, but the community had endured. They had faced monsters, both terrifying and intelligent, and had emerged alive through courage, cooperation, and cleverness. As the sun rose over Eldridge one morning, casting light across the valley, the villagers looked at each other with quiet pride. They had endured fear, adapted to danger, and learned to fight in ways they never imagined. The Terran monsters had tested them, but the village had proven resilient. Strength was not measured solely in power or weapons, but in unity, intelligence, and the willingness to face fear together. Eldridge, battered but unbroken, had survived. The Valley of Eldridge had changed. The village that had once been calm and quiet was now marked by battle and survival, but its spirit remained unbroken. The villagers had endured days of terror, had faced the Terran monsters, and had learned to fight in ways they never imagined. Yet the threat was not gone. The creatures had been driven back, but the villagers knew that one final confrontation might come, and they needed to be ready. Preparation became the focus. The villagers gathered in the central square, now scarred from past encounters, to review everything they had learned. Scouts shared observations about the monsters' habits, reactions, and weaknesses. Strategies were refined. Fires were arranged carefully to guide movements, traps were reinforced, and signals for communication were perfected. The travelers, still among them, reminded the villagers that the Terran monsters were intelligent and patient. Every detail mattered. Every misstep could be fatal, and unity was their greatest strength. Families worked tirelessly. Children carried messages, watched for movement in the forest, and helped with small but important tasks. Mothers and fathers reinforced shelters, set up barriers, and prepared supplies. Elders shared knowledge of the land, pointing out hidden paths, caves, and natural obstacles that could be used as advantages. The villagers moved with precision and purpose, understanding that survival depended on courage, intelligence, and teamwork. Each person played a role and no effort was too small. Then the monsters returned. This time they moved with determination, a coordinated presence that stretched across the forest edges. The villagers watched from vantage points, hearts racing but faces calm. The first monsters stepped into the traps that had been carefully arranged. Pits, tripwires, and controlled fires slowed them down, causing confusion. The villagers had anticipated these reactions, and the monsters' own intelligence now worked against them. The creatures paused, uncertain, as humans moved strategically, guiding them into ambush points and using reflective surfaces and sounds to distract and mislead them. The battle was long and grueling. Every encounter tested the villagers' skills, courage, and endurance. Some monsters were stopped by traps, others diverted by clever strategies, but none were fully defeated. Injuries occurred, and fear was never far from the hearts of those involved. Yet the villagers remained determined. Each success, each small victory, reinforced their confidence. They had learned to anticipate, adapt, and fight as a unified force. Fear had become a tool, sharpening their senses and focusing their actions. During one critical moment, a massive monster broke through a barricade, charging toward the village center. A young man, who had learned from previous encounters, used fire and reflective surfaces to confuse it, guiding it toward a deep pit prepared earlier. The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes flicking between the humans and the traps before finally falling into the pit with a thunderous crash. The villagers watched, exhausted, but relieved. It was a small victory, yet it symbolized everything. They had learned. Observation, patience, and cooperation could overcome even the most terrifying threats. The villagers pressed their advantage carefully. The Terran monsters were intelligent, but they were not infallible. By using their knowledge of the land, understanding patterns of movement, and anticipating reactions, the humans began to force the creatures back. Fires were lit strategically, pathways were blocked, and distractions were used to divide the monsters' attention. Each action required precision and calm under pressure. Every person contributed, from the youngest child signaling movements to the elders guiding strategy. The community had become a well-coordinated organism, each part essential to survival. The fight stretched through the day and into the night. Exhaustion weighed heavily on the villagers, but they refused to relent. They had learned that hesitation could be fatal. Every success, no matter how small, became motivation to continue. The Terran monsters were formidable opponents, but they were not invincible. By using intelligence, strategy, and teamwork, the villagers were able to control the battlefield, forcing the creatures into mistakes and traps. The valley, once a place of terror, had become a stage where human ingenuity challenged raw power. As the night deepened, the monsters' movement slowed. They had learned from previous encounters but were struggling to counter the villagers' tactics. The humans, having anticipated their reactions, used this moment to reclaim territory and reinforce barriers. Fires were lit to guide creatures. Away from homes, traps were reset and the villagers remained vigilant, ensuring no monster could catch them off guard. Exhaustion was universal, yet determination burned brightly. Each person understood that their actions could save lives, and that unity was their strongest weapon. Eventually, the final confrontation came. The remaining monsters were lured into a valley edge where multiple strategies converged. Fires, reflective surfaces, sound signals, and hidden pits all worked together, creating confusion and disorientation among the creatures. The villagers executed the plan with precision. The monsters, unable to advance or escape easily, were forced to retreat into the deep forest, finally disappearing beyond the valley. Silence returned to Eldridge, a silence heavier than any before. because it marked survival. The villagers, though tired and wounded, had prevailed. The aftermath was a mixture of relief, sorrow, and quiet celebration. Homes were damaged, fields burned, and lives changed forever. But the village had endured. Families reunited, embracing those they feared they had lost. Injured villagers received care, and the community worked together to rebuild shelters and fortify defenses. Even in the midst of recovery, a sense of pride and accomplishment emerged. Eldridge had faced overwhelming danger, adapted, and survived through courage, intelligence, and unity. The travelers prepared to leave, having fulfilled their role in guiding the villagers through the crisis. They walked among the people, offering words of encouragement and reminders that the lessons learned would remain valuable in the future. They praised the villagers' bravery, determination, and cooperation, noting that these qualities had made survival possible. The villagers, grateful for the guidance and support, felt a deep respect for the travelers, who had risked their lives to help strangers in need. Life in Eldridge slowly returned to a form of normalcy, though nothing would ever be exactly the same. The valley bore marks of the battles fought, yet it also reflected the resilience of those who lived there. Families worked together to rebuild, children played cautiously, but with laughter returning, and elders shared lessons learned from the ordeal. The village had discovered strengths it did not know it possessed, and had learned the power of unity, intelligence, and courage in the face of overwhelming danger. In the evenings, villagers would gather near the river or in the central square, sharing stories of survival and heroism. Children learned the importance of observation and cooperation, while adults reflected on the strategies that had saved their homes and lives. The Terran monsters had tested them, but the village had grown stronger because of it. The valley, though still shadowed by past terror, now held a sense of hope and preparedness for the future. The villagers never forgot the lessons they had learned. Fear, while natural and powerful, could be transformed into awareness, vigilance, and strategic thinking. Unity and cooperation could overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. Courage was not simply a matter of facing danger alone, but of working together, supporting each other, and trusting in collective strength. Eldridge had survived not because of weapons or brute force, but because the people had learned to use intelligence, observation, and community to confront even the most terrifying threats. As time passed, the valley began to heal. Crops were replanted, homes repaired, and the routines of daily life resumed. Yet beneath the surface, the villagers remained vigilant. They understood that threats could return, and that the lessons of the Terran monsters would remain relevant. The community had been tested to its limits and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united. Eldridge was no longer just a quiet village. It was a place of resilience, courage, and intelligence, where every person had a role in protecting the future. The valley, once a symbol of peace and simplicity, had become a testament to human determination and adaptability. The villagers had faced monsters, fear, and destruction, and had survived through unity, strategy, and courage. Eldridge would never forget the terror of the Terran monsters, but it would also never forget the lessons learned, the heroes who emerged, and the community that refused to surrender. As the sun rose one morning, casting golden light over the valley, the villagers looked out across their land. They saw damage, yes, but they also saw survival. They had endured, adapted, and triumphed, not through force alone, but through the power of intelligence, cooperation, and courage. The Terran monsters were gone, at least for now, but the spirit of Eldridge had proven unbreakable. The village had survived, and in surviving it had discovered the true strength of humanity, the ability to face the unknown, to overcome fear, and to emerge stronger together.